Hello, and welcome to Data Matters Podcast, brought to you by Matatika, the simpler, smarter data platform that doesn't lock you in. In this podcast, we get into the bits and bytes of modern data, uncovering the stories from you, today's data leaders. Hosted by me, Aaron Fethian. So without further ado, let's dive in. Welcome to today's show. We're joined by Jack Doherty from Fresha, who's an analytics engineer and built a team where they're delivering lots of value in internal analytics, as well as building into the product. So they talk us through that experience of the two mindsets and the different ways of thinking and working. So without further ado, let's dive in. Hello, Jack, and welcome to the show. Absolute pleasure to have you on. We were chatting about loads of things before the episode, but before we even get into it, why don't you just take a moment to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about how you got into analytics engineering?
Yeah, sure thing. Well, thanks for having me, Aaron. I'm excited to chat today. So yeah, I currently look after analytics engineering at a company called Fresha. We are building software for the health and beauty industry, focusing mainly on back office, like helping businesses to do everything they need to do to operate, but also trying to build a marketplace for consumers to find new services to book. Kind of like a mid-size, kind of like scaling data team. So currently about 7-8 engineers working specifically on AE. And I think what's cool about like what we do is we really see data as a core part of our product.
Yeah.
It's a very kind of pen and paper industry. I'm sure like you've got experience with people that, barbers love to take cash. They love to take bookings on the phone. They love to have calendars and notebooks, which all feels a bit old school. And like collecting data and analyzing data is one of the big reasons why you would take the jump to our software.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's as an industry, you can visualize it immediately. You can imagine someone keeping track of things, and data just doesn't really exist when it's just on a piece of paper. So
yeah, exactly.
That's part of your proposition.
And it's a lot of data people just it's a given these days that like stuff's digital, right? And you have the data to analyze, but actually it's interesting working in the industry where that's largely not true.
Yeah.
And one of the first battles is just collecting the data to actually work with.
Yeah, and then so thinking about we were talking about the different challenges in your particular company and the kind of size of the team. And I guess where we kind of landed is that you've kind of got the internal analytics as part of your challenge, and then, like you said, part of the product and giving analytics to your users then became part of your challenge as well. And I think the kind of cool thing that when we were chatting about, coming on the show is that actually you were not initially taking on that scope, but that became, you were, as a team were delivering more and more. And you sort of got to this point where they said, oh, why didn't you do more on the product side? Maybe you could take us through that journey of like, what were you delivering and what did he sort of notice that you were doing well? And
yeah, part of me thinks, part back to the days when we didn't have the product facing stuff because it was a lot easier in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Probably a good thing that we're providing more. Yeah, I think it was actually one of the things that appealed to me about joining Fresha a couple of years ago was the fact that we work, as you said, in these two worlds. So we have the kind of like classic internal analytics stuff, but we also have a kind of parallel stack that serves data directly to our users. Yeah. And like that is a key part of the product. Like people pay for it. People notice when it doesn't work. Like it's become part of people's workflows and people's expectations. And it's like two very different modes of thinking, right? And like kind of different paces, which I think is nice to be able to flick between them. The internal stuff is kind of more risky and like you can move quicker and you kind of expect more literacy from your users and more tolerance for mistakes. Whereas the product facing stuff, it's a lot more considered, it's a lot slower, a lot more like rigorous testing, a lot more making sure you don't break things. And also a lot more thinking about like, because we don't have a direct relationship with the user, right? It's all through the UI. Like thinking about how they're going to perceive things, like what mistakes might they make, how can we make this easier for them to understand? Mm-hmm. So it's cool to think of data as a product with people that you don't actually interact with directly. It's very different to building stuff that, you're sitting next to someone and talking through it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you mentioned that you're sometimes just reasoning about what the users are doing and what they're thinking. A lot of companies have analytics about the product and how it's being used. Is that also part of your scope? Is like the kind of click analytics, like they click that button or they dwell on that screen or?
Yeah, a little bit. So we do have like a product analytics stack. That's actually more driven like by the product team, to be honest. They do their own thing, which is nice in that respect. But the kind of analytics that we offer to our users is about their business. So it's basically like us acting like their analytics team, bringing together transactional data, sales, payments, customers, team member stuff, everything that we collect, and then offering it to them in a way that helps them to understand what's going on. And as you said at the beginning, for a lot of people, that's like a proper wow moment when they're like, oh, I can see, trends, and I can see patterns, and I can see like which location's making the most money, or which day of the week's busiest, or I can see where I can afford to get more shifts for my staff, or where we're not very busy, and all of that stuff that suddenly becomes unlocked when you record things in a system that you're blind to otherwise.
Yeah, and I think probably most of the people listening have that kind of more internal analytics role, and quite often having discussions with people about how critical it is to deliver an accurate insight to an internal user, where, like you said, you can meet face to face, you can perhaps repair the damage if you got something a little bit wrong. The idea of there being thousands of users out there where they just judge you based on what you gave them, it's quite a scary prospect.
Yeah, it genuinely is. And I think when engineers join the team, there is definitely this kind of adjustment in like pressing merge on something that's going to impact lots and lots of users. Makes you think, in a good way, you consider everything. You consider edge cases that you would never thought of, or mistakes that you wouldn't necessarily worry about, that you kind of obsess over and make sure you test. And I think it's a good practice. I mean, it feels like I always think like product engineering teams, like the thought of pressing a button and you're pushing something to like an AWS service or like Netflix. The stakes behind that are huge, and obviously like what we're doing is nowhere near that level. But to have a little peek behind the curtain as to what that feels like, and how much rigor and how much confidence you need in order to press that button has been quite fun.
Yeah. And I think that's a journey that, I've been in software quite a long time. And we were chatting about what it's like to deliver product change or software changes versus analytics changes, and the kind of differences. I think the software industry, DevOps was sort of a emerging term, and the idea that your development team could also operate the service. That whole mindset across the kind of industry and the people arriving to it was suddenly like challenged with, you mean I'm going to have to see my code go live? There was always this kind of wall between we hand it over and someone else has to sort of worry about running it. Particularly in a kind of like vendor situation, SaaS companies now often just develop and run. Whereas in product companies, days gone by, we just develop and release, and then someone else kind of runs it. When you think about that kind of change, like you're even talking about clicking merge on the change, there's that same kind of workflow that's become popular in analytics engineering. I wonder if you could, from your perspective, think about the extra overhead that perhaps an internal team has some choice about whether they adopt versus the product team. They don't have to go through this code with the tools are available where there's no code in the kind of analytics space, and then there's this kind of DBT's become really popular, and it's like much more code and merging. I wonder if you could kind of visit the two and compare what's the overhead like of developing it like software. Yeah,
I mean it's definitely slower, right? Because you're being more cautious, and the risks of getting it wrong are higher. I mean, I think internally, we, for example, we wouldn't always test on the full size of data. We do a quick CI run on a subset, and if it passes and we're relatively confident, we'll go for it and then check tomorrow morning that we haven't broken anything. Whereas for the external facing stuff, like our CI runs basically rebuild production, in a separate environment, and we have a lot of assurance in that. We have a lot more tests, which, we run the tests more often, we kind of, and a lot more paranoid about the kind of things that we test, and not just like the classic not nulls, but we're not sharing crazy values, lots of like different kind of almost like semantic testing that we kind of run to make sure we haven't done anything. And also just the kind of the communication as well. So I guess the other thing is the stuff that we build in the warehouse is a contract with a consuming app that then runs the front end and stuff. So that's another consideration, is mostly if you're building like an internal DBT tag and maybe a couple of dashboards, you can control the release cycle and pretty confident on the downstream. But we always have to think, hang on a minute, everything's green for us, but are we breaking anything on the app side, or need to release this at a certain time or coordinate something? And even little things as well, like time of day. There's a very clear usage pattern, so we'll try and release when things are quiet and slightly lower. Whereas for internal, that's not a thing. You merge whenever you're ready.
And do you find the two disciplines influencing one another? Like if you have a developer who's perhaps not used to pushing to production, do you see their behaviors changing when they're delivering internal analytics, perhaps in a good way?
Maybe, yeah, but I also think it's quite hard to flick between the two modes in a way. I think we tend to try and like if we're making a big change on the external stuff, to like dedicate ourselves to that, to get into that kind of mindset and that zone. If on the same day you're kind of like doing some work internal, some work external, it can be a bit like, hang on a minute, like, am I skipping something, or have I messed up? But yeah, I think that kind of sense of like rigor and quality and stuff, like we've definitely, things like linting and CI and stuff that we first built external is now part of what we do everywhere.
Interesting. And we're chatting about some of the technologies involved, and you're as a team, you've got your kind of, I think you call it the platform team, and the other guys who do kind of deliver there's a range of technologies that you're building and investing in. I think you're building semantic layers, and you're delivering near real-time analytics in some cases. And what does that kind of technology stack look like on the product versus the kind of internal as well?
Yeah, that's the other thing actually. It's been because the stuff that powers the product-facing stuff is basically like our analytics stack on steroids. And seeing how far we can push it, and like all these kind of tips and stuff as to how we can make it scale and operate in that world have been fun. So and as you said, we're kind of moving more and more into real time, which is a whole new thing with a whole new set of challenges. So like the current stack is built on Snowflake. We use Snowflake for internal stuff too. But the first big challenge was, how do we scale it to like the number of queries essentially that the app needs us to run? So we ended up hacking together this like multi-account, like reader account based thing. Snowflake were convinced that they were going to get us to pay for their like top tier enterprise thing, which gives you like the bigger warehouses and the higher concurrency. But some of our smart platform engineers realized that we could just provision a bunch of reader accounts and then like create our own load balancers. Like from Snowflake's perspective, they just have like a reasonable number of queries per warehouse, but we can scale that horizontally. So that's like, you'd never do that internally because like you wouldn't need it.
Why would you?
To see it actually work. And then the on the ingestion side, the other big shift actually, because the product requirements were quite strict on freshness. It's like our internal DAGs run every couple of hours, and that's fine for what we need, but because we operate in so many different time zones, and we didn't want our customers to have to wait for their daily sales numbers or whatever they're waiting for. So we had quite strict SLAs on about 30-minute refresh times. So we had to look at our ingestion too, and that kind of forced us to move to like CDC based rather than like batch ingestion from our production warehouses, and really focused us on like cost and optimization, and came up with or deployed quite a few like efficiency techniques like Lambda structures and a lot of incremental models and stuff to really try and operate at that frequency without spending too much money.
Yeah, and obviously, all those non-functional things, the product in a sense is not really changing. The outcome for the user is not changing, but they're getting it an awful lot faster. They're being a lot more up to date. And I think as time goes on, one of the things I noticed is that users' expectations grow, or at least stay in line with the best product they've seen. And the kind of iPhone, or the kind of expectations that arrived with kind of consumer devices suddenly in every B2B. So you've got your users judging you based on getting it right, but also on their expectations of being fast. And what do you mean? I just did that order, so why isn't the analytics there immediately?
Well, this is the other thing is, like, I think non-data users, who obviously most of our people aren't like analysts, why would they be? They don't distinguish between analytics reports and other data sources. And so our app is a blend of like, production DBs and like widgets that come from us and reports that come from us. And so actually one of the big drivers for real time is actually not so much like the need so much as just the feeling of consistency, that like wherever you look, whether it's like driven from a like live production DB for payments or like a sales report, like all of it matches up. And because nothing feels worse as a data user than two numbers that you want to be the same that don't match, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, like, we can communicate that and we give like last refresh that and caveats and stuff, but actually the best experience from our perspective would just be like everything's basically the same freshness. And it does unlock some cool new use cases, but actually it's that consistency thing that's the biggest. Like how do you tell a user that, oh, don't worry, like check back in 20 minutes and it will be right.
Yeah, exactly. Which is probably, potentially one of the arguments for a stronger architecture function that thinks about how products work. Perhaps another thing that I see happening in analytics engineering, mostly internal analytics, is kind of a rejuvenation of the role that's just about structures, just about models, just thinking about how things work together. And that I think kind of goes back to one of the things that we discussed when we were thinking about the episode, that actually there's a lot of habits and engineering type concerns that are arriving into data that software has done for a long time, and there's a kind of influence that they're on that journey. I wonder, did you notice at some point that software engineering and data engineering and this kind of engineering arrival, like the habits were changing? What did you notice in your teams of how they developed those analytics models? We one of the things we were talking about is that it seems to be behind software or following the same kind of trend. And maybe it's leading in some ways, but yeah, perhaps what you give your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess maybe I'll start, like, I'm fairly new to the data world in the scheme of things. So I actually probably only properly got into analytics in the last 5 years or so. And previously I was in more like strategic or product roles, chief of staff for a bit, kind of data adjacent, but not like actually understanding what was going on. So maybe I've got a slightly like unusual perspective or like different set of expectations on how like AE works and how things should fit together. Because it definitely feels like, that on the one hand, we've made so much progress, right? And especially in the last like 5-10 years, obviously the move to cloud, like all these new capabilities, the kind of democratization of being able to do what we do, and like new tools, especially things like DBT, that have really like introduced like what you actually can legitimately call engineering, the kind of analytics space. And the whole role, I mean, like analytics engineers wasn't a thing 10 years ago. Like you have people doing it, they just didn't have the badge of being engineers. So you've got all this like capability and opportunity on the one hand, but also like some fundamental stuff that just doesn't feel mature yet, or like that we're missing something, like some foundational capabilities, and like to really unlock like the promise of all of this capability that we have, but like doesn't seem to materialize all the time into like good products or good experiences.
Yeah, repeatable. Yeah, a lot of stuff goes with that. Yeah.
And I think you're right. I mean, fundamentally, like engineering is about like bringing structure and extracting, helping people navigate like, the full semantics of a business, which like for most businesses is ridiculously complicated. Like it's more than one person could ever hope to know, right? I think it's one of the fun bits, and also like one of the contradictions of being an analytics engineer is like you sort of expected to know everything about like what's going on across an organization. And obviously like as teams scale, you compartmentalize to keep people sane.
Yeah.
But there aren't many roles that you get to like legitimately sit across everything and kind of have the right to poke your nose into everything.
Yeah.
You might be working on like financial ledgers and accounting audits, and then the next week you're looking at like the launch of a product feature and trying to work out if it's changed behaviors. I mean, there aren't many roles that kind of have that breadth, I guess.
Yeah, you're definitely not the first person I've heard say that kind of like the overarching nature of a data team and seeing across everything. That seems to be a kind of when teams realize that, or when people realize that's the kind of remit and the expectation. It's quite no. That's really is really interesting. And no one else has that kind of view.
And I wanted to draw a parallel with software. Is like that's not sustainable, presumably, right? Because like you can't be an expert in everything. And I always get the sense that we're borrowing other people's work and like playing it back in probably a way that's like missing a bunch of nuance. And because like, you're copying someone, like you're not the person that necessarily should be like owning that thing. And I think there's definitely a shift in analytics engineering to thinking more like a platform team. And like, how do we just like, clearly there's the need for like, this like aggregation layer, right? Like this team that kind of bring everything together and provide the structure, like you said, to make sense of things, to organize things, to make it accessible. And I guess like there are like particularly like top level exec questions, like they don't care about microservices or like how the product's structured. They just want to know, well, how many users do we have? How much revenue are we making? Like those questions naturally span several teams and loads of different databases. So like you need a team for that. I get that, but when it comes to like the nitty gritty of like understanding the data that a particular service produces, the people that built it are obviously best placed to do that. And when we come along and ask them questions about what they built, you get like incomplete answers or you miss something. And so what we're offering to the rest of the business is like a poor copy of what we should be offering.
I think some of those ideas there about what you're across. My mind is kind of wandering into how it plays out, and you can kind of imagine that the people who are running the company, they want to know how many users, because that should be a very well defined thing, and the legal department defines that really well because that's what the contracts say, and then obviously sales and commissions are fed off that potentially, so they sort of have a view and have a vested interest in that being right. Those decisions flow into finance, and you can kind of see like they're kind of more than just it's easy to say across the whole company, but when you think about what is the definition of a user, it's like really clearly defined in law somewhere in the company. So to have a sort of ad hoc like we mean that kind of user is like quite jarring for a senior person. That just what it's making me think as you were sort of saying, well, there, that's kind of really hard.
Yeah, I was at a talk last week, and someone was talking about like they're at a much bigger team. I think they were talking about like hundreds of analysts and like a similar number of AEs. I think something that made the audience gasp, but like he was like, yeah, I mean, I've given up on like trying to maintain those kind of definitions centrally. Like we just kind of deal in facts, and then we're comfortable that people interpret them differently. And that just felt like so like kind of anti a lot of like drives towards like, a single source of truth and everything has to be defined and stuff. And it was actually sounding much more pragmatic, to be honest, because like there are legitimate ways.
Yeah, I can see why.
Want things in different ways, right? But I think the thing that's frustrating and maybe actually the real problem is how do we make those definitions non-opaque and provide the context as to why it's defined in such a way.
This
for
is
like,
what I mean by
case, exactly, this is what I mean by in a codified way that's like people can interpret and challenge and offer counters to and stuff. So rather than it being like a hidden black box thing and then you get two different numbers that you expect to see the same, you're like, okay, yeah, cool. Like customer service, they define a user based on like the first time they logged in because that's when they tend to get tickets, whereas the legal team define it when they sign the contract because that's when they're like, legally have a relationship with them. And maybe like, I don't know, product team, define it the first time they used a feature because they don't care about anything. Like all of that is legitimate.
Yeah.
Why can't we support all those definitions at once?
So what are you seeing as good ways of explaining that? Because this feels like another software, another engineering concept that, you write code, you document code, you prove it with tests, but then you write, interfaces and you tell people what the functionality is. In analytics, how are you communicating that what I mean by new user is, and then, the kind of measures? How do you do that?
Yeah, well, I could just be admitting that I'm behind the curve here, and maybe other people have solved this problem, but I'm not sure we are. Like in a standard way, I'm not sure there is like a kind of a agreed set of technologies to encapsulate that. I think there's like we're heading in that direction, and there's some interesting ideas out there. But for me, I think like the missing link in the analytics stack is the semantic layer, and like I love looking at different semantic layers, and I think like particularly with AI and like agentic stuff, like we have to move in that direction because I think a lot of AE teams see their product as like a bunch of database objects, right? But like it's not a definition. A lot of stuff only exists at like the point of aggregation or your particular filter and like things that you can't codify in a table. And when you try to like codify that stuff and then you do like roll-ups and things, then you lose a lot of the flexibility because you have to predefine what people are going to ask basically. And like in the last year, especially as we played around more with like different semantic concepts and stuff, it's been a proper like, this is definitely how this should work. You finally feel like you're encoding like things that people actually like relate to and will ask about. People don't ask about fact sales, and they ask about how much tax did you pay last month, or
real world question.
Or they don't know that an active partner is from this monthly ledger. Like they just like tell me about my customers and stuff. And the semantic layer is the first place where I felt like you're putting that in a structure that actually can be an asset and can be kind of shared and queried and used in lots of different places.
Yeah, that does feel like as an industry, we're still perhaps rediscovering those things. I definitely remember the first time I was challenged on a chart, and the user who's challenging is like, well, yeah, but what are the filters? What are the aggregations? And actually, like, it became pretty apparent that one of the best ways is to just show them, like, let them see the table, let them see what you're making the count of. And like you said, when you're aggregating that up for performance, you're naturally creating a separation from what's going on. So, the semantic layer does solve that to a degree because, well, you get great performance, you still get to drill down to what the decision is, plus you get this kind of real world concept of, okay, what are these things I'm looking at, what will they actually relate back to? Yeah, we keep reinventing those. There's no sort of like well-defined, this is how semantic layers should work or not. There's a whole lot of engineering going on for everyone still.
Yeah, and I think it's about interfaces as well. Right? I've seen a lot of teams try and be like, in order to control all of this, you can only access our data in like this ecosystem, and we're going to like validate everything. Like try taking a spreadsheet off a finance team, or try like taking that HubSpot extract away from the like sales team. It's just not how people work, and it's never like in a realistic organization. It's just you can't enforce that stuff. The semantic layer for me seems like the place that you ensure that consistency, like while letting people talk to your data in whatever way you want, or whatever they want, I should say.
Yeah.
Yeah, and particularly with like chat style interfaces and talking to your data as like through natural language, you have to. I mean, like otherwise you end up with some crazy SQL and lots of hallucinations. Like that semantic context is the thing that gets the most out of these agents.
And increases the accuracy, and when someone asks something, it produces something useful. And,
Yeah.
and you mentioned that chat style interface, and you mentioned AI a little bit earlier. I wonder then, if the semantic layer became richer and more fully functional, would analytics engineering even be a role anymore?
I mean, I hope so, but I think it's evolved. I mean, it's only very new, so naturally it's going to evolve. Like, but I think it would look very different, but it would still be like equally valuable and interesting. I think but it would be more about structures, as you say, and like how do we? I mean, because you still have to create the underlying data sets that define all this stuff in a rigorous way, right? So that doesn't go away. But then on top of that, you're adding the challenge of what questions are people asking of it, and like how do we like organize the kind of semantics of this data in a way that's going to work for people, that they don't have to know about which tables exist, but they can just ask questions using the common terminology of the company and get sensible answers. So I think it becomes a lot more about like people and relationships and understanding like different users and their needs. Maybe less about kind of like wrangling a million charts into
Yeah.
you think they want them, because you're basically like in some ways you're shifting that last mile downstream, right, to the people that actually want to make the request, and your job becomes like facilitating those requests, not directly but indirectly.
Yeah, I do like that sort of concept and that way of thinking about it. If I sort of think over time how that's played out, it used to be the sensing and collecting and the picking out of the metrics that are interesting for analytics was very, very far one way. Like it was basically quite unless you collected at the time, it was gone. And then over time we've probably got more and more used to collecting everything, or in a sense everything, and then building models and sort of deciding what we want to know. And it feels like as a trend, if we're going more and more that kind of fuzzy style, collect absolutely everything and then try and really understand what's happened, the trend seems to be even further that way, pushing it downstream to the users sort of in essence starting to define things when they think of them, and what does that mean in the data. And that's the engineers get more of facilitation from AI in defining those things. And if that becomes sort of lower engineering skill necessary, then users could start doing it and building and modeling. Yeah, that might be
I think you've
a long time away, but that's how it feels like a trend there.
and I think you touched on something, which is we got too much data. Like we're in this kind of like we're at the started with not very much, and now we've got like so much flying around that I don't think we quite know what to do with it. And I think when you define like the semantics of something, it kind of forces you to think about what matters, right? Because naturally you define the things that you think matter, not define everything that you can, right? So actually I think that hopefully it like reduces the surface area, because it's very easy to create like big wide tables, and then you can basically aggregate them in infinite ways, whereas you say actually here are the 10 metrics that we really care about from this entity. It gives people maybe a bit more focus.
Yeah. And do you feel like in the product space, coming back to that, they're a bit more comfortable with just letting things go, like not collecting absolutely everything?
Well, as in
Like not the obsession with. I find that it is almost an obsession with like we're going to have all the data, we're not going to let any of it go, we're going to just have absolutely everything. Whereas I just wondered in the product world where they're like, no, it's fine. We wanted to fund that screen for some users, and that's all we will collect, like because it's performs better, it's easier to manage. Like it feels like they might be more comfortable with it.
Yeah, I think working with product people, like everything's intentional, right? Like you'd never just add a feature that you didn't think anyone was going to use, or like that somehow clashes with something else. Whereas I think data people do that all the time. Maybe we need a slightly different table, or we need to add this, or if only we had this, I think it comes back to that thinking about like, are you helping or are you hindering? Are you adding to the confusion? I think like Ollie had some really good concepts around this. Like our job should be to bring clarity, not additional confusion, right? And just like adding to the amount of possible things that you can query and learn from is not adding clarity. So,
yeah, exactly.
Really like
for anyone who's listening, Jack's talking about an episode a couple of early in the season where Ollie came on, and CEO of Count, and talked about how their tool looks at data and the value of BI tools. And you're right. It like tons of things that resonated with me. Like, how on earth did it come?
And that actually worries me about kind of chat interfaces and opening up even more ways to ask questions. It's like, you realize, I mean, we all learned this with Google like 10, 15 years ago. It's like, yeah, you can ask whatever question you want, but you have to ask the good questions to get the good answers. And there's like a lot of skill in like knowing what to ask.
Yeah.
And I think, hopefully we shift more towards thinking, what should we be asking rather than always trying to answer stuff.
So if that then plays on your mind that's a risk of what chat interfaces to analytics engineering looks like, the kind of the bad. What in your mind is the best use of AI and engineering? What do you see users could really gain from it?
Yeah, well, I don't think we know yet, right? And it's such an exciting time because I bet like whatever I say now is going to be pretty redundant in a couple of years.
Yeah, probably in 30 minutes. Like, it's like that fast.
I think there's a couple of things. I mean, just in terms of like operationally, I think like, development and kind of operating a data platform, like I really hope some of the boring stuff gets increasingly automated. I mean, I was thinking, and again, I might just be outing us as like a not very advanced AE team, so forgive us, but how we respond to like test failures seems really old school. Like we get an alert, or we've got some nulls in here, and then we have to go off and query it, and then we kind of like examine the DAG and figure out where it might have came from, and then like maybe even look at like source repos and see who's committed recently and what might have changed. I mean, all of that feels something like an agent could do that like reasoning for us, rather than getting an alert of a failure. We get hey, I think this service has added this new type of credit note that's broken this, by the way, like here's a fix. That all seems very achievable. I just haven't seen anyone like stitch that all together yet, and all the different metadata that you would need.
I totally agree, and I think there is investment in that. Product teams, but also teams by themselves in companies. And I guess the best I can compare that to is there's a front end like tool that we use that looks at what's happened as an error, looks at the different input, including commits and changes and the actual stack traces, and then makes a pull request and then says, okay, I saw this error happened, this might be your fix, and here's the kind of reasoning why. That doesn't feel that far away from us, in our space. And what I'm kind of most excited about is that because our stack is mostly, generally in our community, like, DBT and Snowflake and, the way we some tools, allow us to work on code. That means that pull requests and changes and actually committing a change, proposing a change is more available. I've always been quite negative about UI-only tools. I can never really get a sense of why I was so negative about it, though, because it's like, well, I do lose the change history straight away, but this kind of like brings it all together. Like, I can't tell what happened or why the history of that is, whereas that is available as context now, and that means some agent can propose a change, and I'd be really bullish on that as a space to spend energy.
Yeah, and it's just like, it's not the kind of work that we want to be doing, right? So like, we'd be happy to automate that. I think
you still have the control, right? Like, it's a proposed change. It's not
of course, like
autonomous chaos.
You're reviewing, like you're checking stuff, but the legwork of getting to the answer is somewhere else. I think Tristan was talking about like two types of agents that they're thinking about, like the observability agent and the development agent. And I can't wait for the observability agent, honestly. Think about how much metadata like we all have to pass around data platforms, costs and usage and test failures and runtimes and all that stuff that's just waiting for someone to automate and take that off us, I think.
Yeah. What was the other agent you remind us of? So I get that metadata and what's going on around it, and then the engineering is more like the code assistant.
Yeah, the development agent, as they call it. So they're kind of the more classic software engineering, like code gen, coding assistance kind of stuff. That I think we like data are lagging behind, right? Because I think that the challenge of data platforms is always like it's not the system is not just defined by the application code. I think a lot of software, if you understand the repo, the project as a whole, you understand how it functions, and you can unit test it, and you can be sure of its behavior. Whereas like analytics code, more often than not, is built on assumptions of another system, whether that's a warehouse or a data source or something. So
we kind of know that to be true because we can't just develop on test environments. Like, we have to see the real production like data, like, because it's gappy and it's like there's things missing, and that definitely resonates with me.
And not to sound like an absolute broken record, but like I feel like that's another semantic problem in a way, because you can obviously like define like a classic assumptions about a data set, you know, primary keys and like foreign key relationships and not nulls and stuff. But it's very hard to codify, okay, like I expect this to represent this. Like I am assuming that like this subscription period, for example, like represents a period of time where someone had access to the product.
Yeah.
Where do you put that? And how do you test?
Yeah. How do you communicate that?
Often you only know you're wrong when someone says, well, that doesn't look right.
Yeah. I wonder if that phrase strikes fear into everyone's
Yes.
Because as soon as someone says that, like, oh God, you know, and they're generally right, you know, they get that real sense. So it probably means that it was always able to be spotted because they could immediately spot it. You know, that's always.
I think that's like another contradiction in like AE and data generally. Is like I think when you work in data, you realize that like you have to be skeptical of every data set, right? Because it's built on all these like fragile assumptions and like the tiniest little condition can completely change how you think about something, right? So like you know, one filter or like one. I always come back to the example of like we were seeing like a small handful of our customers were creating like ridiculous high value services and was making some of our metrics like pretty mental. And turns out they were just like using us as a calendar and they were just having some fun selling like £1 million haircuts. So like nothing had broken, you know, like the numbers were accurate and like it was reflecting their behavior, but like, you know, we can never get a guess. Would do that, which doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
You know what? But I guess people always think, you know, like data is like analytics, you know, it's fact, it's rigorous, like it can never be wrong. Whereas actually like data practitioners obviously know that it's always built on assumption and pretext and context and stuff. So I think that's like a funny contradiction of like, you have to, the best teams are like open about that, right? You have to kind of convey this sense of like trustworthiness, but also at the same time be skeptical of everything.
Do you know what that is just classic and you know probably timeless advice for data teams. Yeah, and I feel like we could actually carry on for a lot longer. I really enjoyed looking at the differences of how data teams operate, how teams operate. You know, the kind of different approaches. I wonder, we might have to wrap up though. I wonder if in wrapping up, you could give some advice or some kind of practical takeaways for a team who's in analytics engineering and has been asked to do some product engineering and deliver analytics there. Because you've lived that journey. That might be a really good space to leave some advice.
Yeah, I mean, like, I would recommend it because I think it teaches you so much about what it actually takes to build true kind of software products, and you get a glimpse and that kind of experience around, pressing that button, as I said earlier, is definitely invaluable. But I would take it slow. Start with like some very simple use cases, build confidence, build trust. There's nothing like scale slowly, make sure that you're not like promising things that you can't deliver. And also, I mean, this is true of any project, but particularly like product stuff is like you'll build the initial model in a day, and then you'll spend 2 weeks like working on the weird edge cases, or the one record from last year that doesn't make sense, or the 2 customers that have found a way to like configure something weird, which I think is like the classic kind of software adage. But yeah, I would go for it basically, like, because I think what we've seen is once you prove, like, software product teams, they're very constrained by like the data that they have access to, their databases and the things that like their particular application produces, and once you kind of open the doors to say, well, actually, if you wanted to, you could get a feed from these guys, or we could join your stuff with their stuff, and and we can like build something new. You get a lot of creativity and kind of new ideas coming out, and then more work to do, which may be a bad thing.
Yeah, I really like that advice. If you imagine the product team, the way you've painted them, the rigor is like really important. If you have to drive everything through that same level of rigor, you never get the opportunity to add context and make some wider judgments. That's kind of really interesting. Jack, absolute pleasure. Really value that advice you're giving people. Hopefully there's some amazing takeaways there for teams that are just getting into product or have this particular problem. But even just looking at the teams and the way they operate, I think there's tons of value in what you've shared with us today. So thank you for coming. I
appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. Brought to you by Matatika, the simpler, smarter data platform. Data Matters aims to share the latest technology directions and your experiences in modern data. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not hit the follow button and stay up to date with new episodes as they're released. Finally, if you feel the episode could benefit someone you know, please share it with them. And we're always on the lookout for guests with interesting experiences to share. This has been Data Matters. I've been Aaron Fethian, your host. And until next time, bye for now.